Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. Just going to allow a few minutes for people to join us. Be back shortly. Okay. Well, we're going to get started. We've got some preliminaries to get through. So, thank you for joining us today. My name is Ezra Beeman. I'm Managing Director of Energea. We have offices here in Davis, California, and Sydney, Australia. And I'll be taking you through our webinar today on building electrification. So, in today's presentation, we're going to cover CO2 pathways, building emissions, electrification barriers, a case study, and then speak about program funding, which has been a key challenge to date. In terms of housekeeping items, we are going to be recording the webinar today, and you will receive a link so that you can watch it again or send it to people you think might be interested. Please do add your questions to the chat. As it says here, my colleague Sarah will be monitoring them and will then organize them and submit them at the end of the presentation, and we'll have a short Q&A session. So without further ado, oh, sorry, one other thing is there will be the ability to vote in on the next topics or to give us some feedback as to what you would like to see in future webinars, which we will take into consideration. So please don't forget to do that. You could do it at any time. So without further ado, let's get into the content. So this section is going to cover off CO2 pathways in the U.S. As the U.S. Seeks to achieve its Paris Accord agreements, it will be looking to decarbonize various sectors of the economy, of which the commercial and residential buildings are a key contributor to our current emissions profile. And what we'll do is we'll start to talk about how the US is seeing that being achieved, at least in the near term. Here we have the Paris Agreement, which the US recently signed up for. And you can see that by 2030, we are obligated to reduce our emissions levels to 50% of 2005. In terms of how we go about it, there's a couple of scenarios provided by the EIA. You can see under the baseline, everything is relatively flat, which is still a savings considering population and economic growth. You can see on the bottom left graphic how that breaks out in terms of key sectors being transport, industrial, electric power generation, and then the residential and commercial sectors. So on the right bottom graphic, you can see when we've sort of blanked out everything that's not to do with buildings, how that residential and commercial building emissions breaks out in terms of the sources of the emissions by fuel, so electricity, coal, natural gas, etc. So it's only about 25% of our total emissions, but it is definitely a significant amount of them that needs to be addressed. So if you jump into that, I guess, and look at it again across the EIA building electrification scenarios by subsegment, being residential, commercial, we've included industrial for completeness. You can see here that residential goes from 1,500 terawatt hours to about, I don't know, 1,800 terawatt hours by the end of it, and that is the largest increase that we're seeing. You see a slightly lower level of increase due to commercial and industrial. So even though we're looking to decarbonize by 2050 for the most part, you're not seeing a huge amount of increased consumption, and that is partially due to the strategies in the federal government's plans, which are for heavy amounts of energy efficiency at the same time. So when looking at the electrification scenarios called aggressive benchmark, you can see that most of the savings from emissions reductions are going to come in the 2030 to 2050 period. You can see the 2030, there's not much here. So a lot of their assumed decarbonization happens in the back part of the period. And the other thing is you can see that most of it is focused on residential. And that in large part is a reflection of how much emissions currently occur in residential compared to commercial. And you see here, there's electrification, there's energy efficiency, and then there's demand flexibility. So you're welcome to dive into this a little bit more deeply, but we wanted to just foreshadow, what is the U.S. current level of emissions? How does it currently plan to reduce them as a lead into our discussion around how we see best practice building electrification working, given the projects we've done both in Australia and in the U.S. So let's talk about what we think is best practice building electrification modeling. There are many ways you could model building electrification or building emissions. Our preferred approach is using a bottom-up method where you actually analyze all of the stock, all of the turnover. You may do it at a building level or a premise level. Our preferred approach generally is at the premise level, and you can see here there's a lot of information that goes into it. The existing appliance stock, the rate of new buildings, the rate of building remodeling, when appliances are going to reach their end of life. That then goes into an uptake function here, which is driven by an uptake propensity. And we'll get into this in the rest of the analysis. Down here, the appliance economics, how much does the technology cost? What are the fuel prices? What sort of rebates there are? From that, then it spits out, basically what the adoption is and what the outcomes are in terms of emissions, in terms of energy consumption, which can then, with 8760 profiles, be used to estimate electricity sector impacts, gas sector impacts, and customer impacts. Um, so let's dive into that a bit more. So to start with a model like this, what you typically need is an estimate of what consumption is for each of the type of building or premise. Here we have an example where we've brought together information for small and medium-sized enterprises. So you see an estimate for offices, hospitals, aged care, um, and this is actually across a whole state. But it would you divide it by the number of premise to get the consumption on average. You can report that in terms of the end use. You can report it in terms of the types of buildings. But fundamentally, building a good data set is a first step for doing what we consider to be best practice estimation of building electrification. Um, in the US, the NREL res and Comstock models are not a bad place to start. And if there's anything that you have that's more localized, it's good to obviously factor that in. But what we're finding when we model in California, in Colorado, in Washington, D.C., and other places is that this data set is generally available to differing degrees. And you can actually have a relatively granular estimation of what your current starting point is, which is fundamental for modeling and identifying what a least cost pathway might look like. So one of the first things that we do once we have the initial stock and turnover rates is to be able to identify, well, what is the level of appliance turnover? And that can be driven by things like the end of life of appliances or new premise construction and or remodeling of existing premises. And based on that, that's just the underlying sort of market potential, if you will. And you can see here's an estimate. It's again broken out by those previous categories of small and medium-sized commercial. You can then turn that into potential gas savings and energy savings. This is not what any program is going to actually deliver unless there's an outright ban on everything, in which case this is the sort of outcome you could expect, less any sort of cheating assumption or cheating activity. Um, how we actually process this into achievable targets is really then a function of our understanding of standards and regulations and how that impacts on the underlying potential. And then anything that's not governed by standards or regulations is governed by customer behavior. And we'll talk about that in a second. So, for example, here's a capture of changes in standards and regulations in California. You can see that there is a new build ban on gas-fired appliances here, and then at end of life they're looking for 80% and then 100%. So this would be overlaid on the previous graphic to then generate, well, how much of the activity is governed by standards and regulations, and then we turn to the final number, which is customer behavior. Now, in some of the recent work we've done in California, we've identified what is sort of a best practice rate of adoption, which is not super high, but what the average rate is. And the difference is between the two, and also what is potentially available above this, is really a function of the barriers. And we'll get on into those in a second. Now, the barriers aside, like split incentives between landlords and renters, one of the key drivers of customer behavior is the financial incentive. And so, our modeling will typically try and relate the financial costs of switching against what are the benefits. And so, the way that we tend to look at this is the difference between the existing incumbent technology like a gas water heater or a gas space heater versus electric hot water heat pump or electric air heat pump. And where you see a significant penalty for staying with the incumbent, that starts to drive uptake. And so in this example model here, we're showing that if you don't actually benefit over a particular time frame, then we're not really expecting anybody to change. Which is, you could modify this and change the uptake curve. But for now, we're just saying like at no benefit there'll be no change, and that you really have to get uh, up to about 20%, 40% there must be a 20 to 40% cost savings or penalty before you're starting to see any sort of increase. Oh, sorry. So costs are remaining with the incumbent as you go from 0 to 150%. You can see the actual uptake going from 0 to 20%, right? And what we typically will identify is at basically at 80%, it just goes flat because there will be certain people who won't adopt at all. And we do our best to parameterize this to data that's available. So, for example, EIA data on sales of gas versus electricity compared to what the differential is in terms of the electricity cost versus gas costs. That would be how we actually would set this up in practice. So, a key question then is, well, what is the impact of adding in incentives, and how do they compare to the any sort of marketing spend? And this is a great study that NREL did that looked at the impact of both marketing spend and incentives on uptake, right? So you have here residential when there was no installation required, like a CFL, sorry, light bulbs, and here where there was installation. And so the installation required is really what we're looking at for the purpose of for the purpose of water heaters, space heaters, etc. And you see here the participation rate and the annual incentives. So as incentives, people can save more and more money. You can save 150 bucks a year. You have a certain level of increase in participation rate, but it's not great. I mean, there's just not a lot of sensitivity. What you do see here with this work is that if you want to actually go up to a higher and higher level of uptake rate, you need to increase your level of marketing spend. And I think that's something that we're not seeing a lot in the programs we've reviewed, and something that we do promote is that it's important to do the advertising. It's important to raise awareness, and marketing spend is generally how you do that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the barriers. And I want to lead with some recent work that we've done, which went out to the program administrators and asked them what they thought the key barriers were. And so, high upfront cost to consumers was just pretty much said by everyone. And so, when consumers are faced with buying a heat pump or a gas heater, the fact that the heat pumps are significantly higher cost is the number one barrier. There are concerns about reliability. They already have low energy costs, and it doesn't seem like it's worth switching. So there's a whole range here, right? But what we then did is looked at, well, how can we address that barrier and try and get programs going from whoops, here we are, from the average of current practice to best practice and even above. And so that really went to trying to address all of the barriers, and then particularly have a big focus on the financial incentive. So our preferred way of looking at the financial incentive is to take the capital difference, the capex, and then considering a time frame that most people are going to be in a dwelling. And so you can look at research around how long people are in their own home if they own it versus how long they're there if they rent it. Some data we've provided here. And so what we've done up here is we've looked at 4-year operational costs and then the upfront costs. It's really how people, in most cases, would be looking at this. Now, the renters generally don't get to make these decisions, and maybe we could modify it. But usually, the research shows that people have very high discount rates and don't generally think in economically rational terms. They want to sort of get their money back relatively quickly. So if you look at this in space heating, right, electric heat pumps cost a lot more up front, but the actual ongoing costs are much lower. But in the current environment, it's still not looking like a payoff. And I must add that this wasn't done in California, for example. This was done in a different jurisdiction. So this needs to be updated. The point is, when you're looking at customers' financial incentives, the heat pumps don't necessarily pay off on a short customer behavior basis, and that's where policy interventions can really be helpful. And so, for example, if you take the upfront cost and you then start to consider some of the incentives that might be applying, and in this case, we've looked at the IRA, both the EEHI and the HEEHRA, and these are estimates. So again, do your own work here, but it has a significant impact on the potential upfront costs, which then will significantly modify how consumers might see this barrier to them. And what we're seeing is program designers looking to further offset this, particularly in the low income group and potentially in the middle income group, so that this no longer becomes a barrier. So the federal government is doing a lot here, but there's still significant barriers, particularly around space heating, with cooking and water heating, almost much more line ball, and that will change the economics when somebody's considering these investments. Okay, let's talk about move on to grid barriers. So one of the key questions is when we convert all of this gas demand to electricity, how is it going to impact on the network? Well, that depends on where you are, for example, and whether or not you've got a winter peaking system. Because if it's winter peaking and a lot of the gas is used in the morning to keep warm, and you're seeing this in this example here, then that could contribute pretty strongly to additional to peak demand growth. But if you're in like California, where we live in the Central Valley, it's really a summer peaking system, and most of the peak demand is in the evening. In this particular gas profile, this could still contribute to the evening, and it's best to look at this not just on an average basis, but in the evening. But in the seasons that matter. And here you see that on the summer, there's hardly any contribution. So one, we have to understand what the gas consumption profiles are, but and understand how that might impact on the grid. But then there's an opportunity to mitigate those issues. Here we've sort of we've done modeling across different scenarios, and we identified when the change in the peak demand timing is. So what we're seeing here is that it's gone from January peak demand to August. Now this is in Australia, so January is really the summer, and it's moving actually to a winter peak here. So in this particular analysis, the movement of all of this gas onto the electricity grid actually created a new peak. That may happen or it may not. It really depends on the situation and what the climate is. But there's a lot that can be done. So in that same example, we looked at potential mitigations, and particularly behind the meter storage. And so across these scenarios of business as usual with energy efficiency, PV, energy storage, and a distribution system operator, what that looked like, and then different electrification scenarios. What is implemented, particularly around solar and storage, can have a big impact. And what we're showing here is that with orchestration, i.e., the coordination of, in this case, EV charging, you can offset a lot of the change of increasing water heating and space heating by moving around the charging as much as possible. Here we're showing some load that is offset by the rooftop PV. So there's a lot of potential for load flexibility in the system, particularly over time, that should be factored into any sort of system analysis of building electrification impacts and mitigations. So let's talk about the natural gas sector. So this again has to be updated for a given market. What we found in this particular project was that dwelling costs, i.e., reticulation of natural gas in the house, was a significant cost. It was the largest cost. The actual service connection and the distribution um, system costs were not even as big. So it's important that all of these get considered in any sort of cost benefit assessment. And of course, the thing that's not included here is the cost of decommissioning. And we're in a project right now looking at best practice decommissioning methods and associated costs. And there is information out there, but it is relatively sparse at the moment. So we're looking forward to seeing more work in this space to better inform policy and regulatory decisions. All right. Let's talk about industry barriers. So if we go and we implement policy and regulatory changes or programs, how well can the workforce adapt to that? So in this particular example, we've got sort of a base load of licensed practitioners over time to serve the existing gas and electricity requirements from new construction, remodeling, end of life, etc. Um, Now, this is an example where changes in policies are relatively occur relatively early, like a complete ban on gas, and you can see there's a massive increase in demand for some of these practitioners, and a massive change in demand for others, like in the gas industry. What we found when we looked at optimizing policy and regulatory impacts is to shift the bigger any bigger interventions into the future so that there is a pathway for the workforce to adapt over time. And that's what we would be recommending, generally speaking, for any jurisdiction that is looking to enforce any kind of end of life or new build construction requirements, and that could generate a step change in demand for labor to give it time to adjust. So the final slide here, and then we've got a little bit of time for questions, is when we looked at this in a jurisdiction, we had a base case, and we were able to look at whole of system, right? Not just the impacts on electricity or gas, but the impact on builders when they're building new buildings under these rules and regulations, the impact on people that occupy those dwellings, the impact on the gas industry, the impact on the electricity industry, and you can sort of see the whole of system costs here on a net present value basis. You've got the base case. We looked at a solar install mandate on its own. We then looked at a full electrification basis, and then we looked at electrification only without the solar install mandate. And that gave us some outcomes in terms of differences to the base case scenario that were largely actually higher, and they were higher than the base case because of the impact on the electricity system. For the most part, there was also, whether it was electricity costs and or the costs of the network, the network infrastructure for electricity, and it was not offset by savings in the network. However, when we looked at the potential mitigation, and so it has 1B for 1A, which is base case plus mitigations, solar PV plus mitigations, et cetera, we were able to then identify positive business cases. So I guess the key message here is that initially you may not see benefits to industry or consumers or economic benefits over the project life cycle, but with an additional step to implement and identify mitigations, you can get, or we were able to get there in this particular example. So the final slide is just talking about some of the key program barriers and solutions, particularly around impacts to stakeholders. So the economics might work, but wealth transfers can be a barrier. So for example, consumers, owner occupiers, they might have higher electricity equipment costs that can be addressed by gap funding and financing. Landlords, they have the same issue. Again, similar potential solution. For builders, they've got a higher appliance costs. That there can be gap funding there as well. Um, for the gas industry, higher retraining costs. Here we're identifying that there could be some targeted program funding to mitigate that, whether it's on retraining funding and also to mitigate those step increases. There's a wealth of other information and detail in here that I haven't gone into, but it's there for those that are just going to download and read the presentation in their own time. But otherwise, I think we get to the key takeaways. It's an essential part of the U.S. decarbonization pathway. There are basically four main electrification triggers, being new build, replacement, end of life, and retrofit. and that these electrification impacts different stakeholders and consumers differently. The key barriers to electrification are higher upfront costs, higher grid costs, and industry capacity constraints, as well as program funding. And electrification can impact on electricity sector costs, but these impacts can often be mitigated. So bans on on appliances in new construction or at end of life can create step changes in workforce requirements. So our key recommendations here are that you should use bottom up modeling of premises at the subload level to really identify and understand what the impacts are across different customer types and how that then impacts on the electricity and gas sectors as well as the workforce. It is possible to overcome the cost barriers via financing or rebates, and it is possible to recover these costs depending on your situation, the impulse on electricity usage aligned with expected benefits. This works better if you're a muni, for example, than if you're, uh, say, somebody that doesn't have access to both the electricity and the program costs and benefits. So we can overcome electricity grid cost barriers by ensuring cost-reflective pricing, which will help avoid cost shifting across subsidies, and the encouragement of load flexibility and management. A largely unknown key risk is the cost of gas network decommissioning, which we believe could be at least partially funded by repurposing of electricity benefits. But again, that has to come through careful management of electricity rates as well. And finally, we can address potential industry labor constraints by giving industry plenty of notice, staggering any bans to minimize step changes in demand, and ensuring retraining capacity and fairness. All right. So please don't forget to vote on what you would like to see in next webinar. And I will then open it up for questions. I appreciate there's only a couple of minutes left. So those of you who have joined us, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you next time. You're always welcome to reach out if you have specific questions. Um, and other than that, I will await any um, questions. Please don't forget to vote. Well, it looks like we've got a pretty shy audience today, which is absolutely okay. Oh, here we have one. How important is building fabric, insulation, window quality in realizing the benefits of electrification of space heating, including time shifting energy use? So, building fabric and energy efficiency generally can be a very important uh, cofactor here. And best practice is to understand how the two relate because changing your insulation can have a lot more barriers than maybe installing a water heater. But working together, it can lead to uh, downsizing or right sizing, I guess, of the equipment to save money as well. And that's not something we've touched on here, but it's a really important question. And we believe best practice is to consider both those options for consumers over time, particularly as you do program design. All right. Well, we are at the hour. Thank you again for attending today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.